Welcome to the Middle School Cafe podcast, where we're serving up fresh strategies and solutions for ELA teachers just like you. Join us as we explore proven methods to bridge the achievement gap and help every student reach their full potential. Whether you're a veteran teacher or just starting out, grab a cup of coffee and a notepad and let's get started. Here's your host, Carolyn Wall.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. If you've been listening to the podcast over the last few weeks, you know I started a brand new community called Building Strong, Confident Readers. What I love best about this new community is that it lives off of Facebook. No more competing with the algorithms to decide when or if you get to see discussions. This past Sunday, we had our official launch party, which was great and so much fun. Some of you have already joined us over there, and I'd love for you to be part of that as well. There's a link to the free community in the show notes. In the last episode, we talked about why teaching research often feels overwhelming. We spent time unpacking the idea that research isn't hard because students can't do the work or because teachers don't know how to teach it. It feels hard because too many skills are happening at the same time. For many school districts, research is treated like its own event. It's something we do when we teach a specific subject. It's something that lives inside a specific unit, something tied to a big writing project, or something we need to do before state testing. And when research is framed that way, it becomes an isolated mess. Students are reading, taking notes, deciding what matters, paraphrasing, organizing ideas, and sometimes trying to produce a final product. When all of that happens simultaneously, it's no wonder research starts to feel overwhelming and why we see so many students shut down. But that overwhelm doesn't come from the skills themselves. It comes from the assumption that all of those skills belong only inside a research unit. That assumption shapes how we teach research and how students experience it. One of the biggest misconceptions around research is the idea that research skills live inside a unit, that students only do research when they are working on a research project. And if that's how research is presented, it makes sense that it feels separate. It makes sense that students don't recognize the thinking they're being asked to do. And it makes sense that everything feels heavier than it needs to be. Because research isn't an isolated skill. It's a collection of reading, writing, and thinking skills that students are already using in other contexts, and something that you are teaching throughout the year. Today's episode continues our series focused on teaching research in a way that feels more manageable and more realistic. Today, we're talking about evaluating evidence, but not in the way it's usually framed. We're looking at where that thinking already shows up in everyday instruction. We tend to think that evaluating evidence starts once students begin gathering sources or writing their paper. But evaluating evidence actually happens much earlier. It happens during reading. It happens during discussion. It happens during written responses. It shows up in small, everyday moments that don't get labeled as research. When evaluation is tied only to a big research project, it's easy to feel like we haven't taught it yet, or that students aren't ready for it. But when we really look at what's already happening in our daily instruction, a different picture starts to emerge. If you think about your day-to-day lessons, evaluating evidence is already woven throughout. When you ask students to answer a question using evidence from the text, they're not just finding information, they're deciding which detail actually supports their thinking. If you give students multiple quotes and you ask them to choose the one that best fits their response, they're weighing options. They're deciding what matters most for the point they're trying to make. That's evaluating evidence. When students are reading articles, whether in your class or in social studies or science, they are evaluating evidence. And this matters more than we sometimes realize because students don't experience school as separate subjects the way we do. When evaluating evidence is named across classes, even informally, students recognize it as a way of thinking, not a task tied to one assignment or one subject. Choosing evidence in science, explaining a claim in social studies, or supporting an answer in ELA all require the same kind of decision-making. When students see that connection, they're not relearning the skill each time, they're applying it. That recognition strengthens transfer. Students start to understand that research thinking isn't something new they have to learn later. It's something they already know how to do, just applied in different contexts. When students highlight or annotate, they're making decisions about importance. They're deciding what's worth keeping and what can be left out. Even when they get it wrong, that process is still evidence evaluation in action. That's the same thinking research requires. Evaluating evidence isn't a separate research skill that only shows up during a research unit. It's a thinking habit students practice anytime they explain, justify, or support an idea using text. Research doesn't introduce this thinking, it extends it. Instead of working with one text, students work with several. Instead of choosing one piece of evidence, they choose multiple. Instead of supporting a short response, they build toward a larger explanation. But the core work doesn't change. Seeing evaluation as something students already practice helps shift how we approach research instruction. Instead of treating it as an isolated skill set, it becomes a matter of naming the skill they already know and reminding students that they use this kind of thinking every day across multiple subjects. And this shift also gives teachers permission to stop trying to teach everything at once. When you recognize that students already know how to evaluate evidence, you don't have to front load every research unit before students begin. You don't have to wait until students are ready to start research work. Instead of thinking, I need to teach all of this before we start, the focus becomes, which part of the thinking process are we practicing right now? That changes how research instruction feels. You're no longer trying to manage every piece at the same time. You're making intentional choices about what students are working on and what can wait. Research doesn't have to feel like a switch you flip during a unit. It can build naturally out of the thinking students are already doing, one decision at a time. At its core, evaluating evidence is a decision-making process. It's not about finding information. It's not about copying details. It's about deciding what matters and why. And that decision-making happens all the time in reading instruction. One reason this connection isn't always obvious is because we keep it packaged within a research unit. When we call out the research skills embedded in our daily instruction, they become visible. They feel obvious. That familiarity matters. When students recognize the kind of thinking they're being asked to do, research feels less intimidating, not because it's easy, but because it's understandable. They understand what is being asked of them and recognize they already know how to do it. That mindset matters. Once you start to see research as something you're already teaching, instruction becomes more intentional and less overwhelming. It also opens the door to naming the skill for students and making those connections visible. This might mean pausing during a lesson and saying, this is the same kind of thinking we used when we were choosing evidence for that article last month, or pointing back to a past activity and reminding students, you've already done this kind of work. Now we're just using it with more information. When you use past lessons as reference points, research stops feeling like a brand new experience or isolated research skill. It feels familiar. Students can anchor new tasks to thinking they already know how to do, and that familiarity builds confidence. When students recognize that evaluating evidence is familiar thinking, they stop guessing what research is supposed to look like. They know where to start, what questions to ask themselves, and what they're being asked to decide. One of the first things you'll notice is less copying and pasting. I'm sure we can all appreciate that. When students understand that the goal isn't to collect as much information as possible, but to decide which information actually matters, they're less likely to copy large chunks of text. They understand they have choices to make, and that decision-making gives them more ownership over the work. You may also notice more purposeful note-taking. Students aren't writing everything down just in case. They're starting to ask themselves, does this detail help answer my question? Does it support the idea I'm working on? That decision-making changes how they interact with sources. And that decision-making doesn't stop at the notes. It shows up in their writing. We've all read student paragraphs where a quote is tacked on at the end, clearly added because they needed a quote, not because it actually supports their idea. When students understand that evidence is something they choose, not something they add on, their writing changes. They use evidence with purpose and make clear connections between their ideas and the information they include. When students realize that research is really about putting their reading and thinking skills into practice, it stops feeling like a guessing game. They recognize the kind of thinking they're being asked to do. They know how to begin, what questions to ask themselves, and what success looks like for that part of the work. When students are clear on what they're being asked to do, confidence follows. The work hasn't been simplified. Students just understand how to apply the reading and thinking skills they already know, and that makes research feel more manageable. As we wrap up, I want to come back to the idea that sits underneath this entire episode. Research isn't something that only happens during a research unit. It's something students practice all year long through reading, writing, and discussion, whether that's in your ELA class or another subject. When students decide which detail supports an idea, when they explain why a piece of evidence matters, when they choose what to include and what to leave out, they're doing research thinking. They may not call it that yet, but the thinking is already there. Why does that matter? And why do I keep repeating it? Because it means you're not starting from scratch when it's time to teach research. You're building on skills your students have already been practicing. When you begin to name those skills and connect them back to familiar work, research stops feeling separate and starts to feel like an extension of your everyday instruction. That shift doesn't require new lessons or more time. It's about recognizing what's already happening and making it visible for students. In the next episode, we'll build on this idea by looking at another piece of research thinking: how students begin to recognize bias in informational texts. That work depends on the same evaluation skills we talked about today, and it grows out of the same daily reading habits. Before you go, I have one small favor to ask. If this episode helped you see research a little differently or helped something click, consider sharing it with a teacher friend who's teaching research right now or who's been feeling overwhelmed by it. And if you have a moment, leaving a quick review of the podcast is one of the best ways to help other ELA teachers find it. Thanks for spending part of your day here with me, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for joining me today. As a reminder, a new episode drops every first and third Tuesday, so be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. Be sure to visit middleschoolcafe.com to find links to everything mentioned in today's show. Until next time.